so we can finish up with chapter 34. Keep in mind your last exam, a week from today, just covers chapters 32 through 34. Okay. All right, we left off here talking about tetrapods. Now, tetrapods are gnathostomes that have limbs. Well, how do we define an gnatostome? What do we mean by gnathostome? Can anybody tell me? And then it got quiet again. So what is a gnathostome? There's four of you here. One of you's got to know. Yeah, vertebrates with a jaw. Okay, but now we're talking tetrapods. Down here is where we explain. Roughly about 365 million years ago, the belief is that the fins of some lobe fin fishes gradually evolved into what we know now in anatomy as the upper and lower limbs, okay, or the hind and the fore and hind limbs of tetrapods. Tetrapods just meaning tetra and the pod meaning 4 feet. Now, before then, all vertebrates had fish-like anatomy. So this was one of the most significant events in vertebrate history. After the early forms of tetrapods colonized land, many species evolved, including those that had the ability to walk, to fly, as well as to hop. Now, so if you recall, we talked about the chordate body plan. Okay, and that chordate body plan consisted of 4 traits. And it's those 4 traits that led to not just giving you the overall body plan for all chordates, but also explaining why 2 of the 11 subphyla are actually invertebrates that are grouped together with vertebrates. It has to do with that chordate body plan. But if we recall, we started adding on additional traits to that chordate body plan, such as traits having to do with being vertebrates, such as traits having to do with being gnathostomes. Now we're adding on more traits specifically to those species in our final 3 phyla: amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. These all make up our tetrapods. So we add on additional traits to the body plan, such as instead of a pectoral and pelvic fins in these lobe fin fishes, we now have 4 limbs with digits, which is what the way we usually define tetrapods. We have the fused pelvic girdle to the backbone. So in other words, the hip bones, part of the hip bones fuses together with the backbone. What's the advantage to this? Well, it allows forces generated by the hind limbs when one moves to be transferred throughout the rest of the body. In other words, you can absorb more of an impact when moving. We have the absence of gills. Well, what type of gill? What are we talking about specifically? Pharyngeal slits. Okay. We have the absence of gills, which are also known as pharyngeal slits, except in some aquatic species where they still exist. But in other tetrapods, instead of these pharyngeal slits or clefts, we now have these pharyngeal clefts or slits giving rise to ears, head, and the neck. A discernible neck, which is down here, which is the 5th trait. A neck, which is discernible neck, which allows for the separate movement of the head from the rest of the body or the torso. And then we have the ears, which are derived from this pharyngeal clefts and slits. Okay. In addition to that, the ears, which in anatomy, we divide the ear into 3 regions: the external ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And within the inner ear, we have sensory receptors that are responsible for detecting airborne sounds. So this is another modification that occurs. Now, as far as the origin of tetrapods go, the belief right now is, okay, that during the Devonian period, okay, which is highlighted down here, there were coastal wetlands which were home to lobefin fishes. And I don't know if you watched the video on some of these lobefin fishes, specifically our dipnoi, which are known as lungfishes. Okay, I actually posted an extra video up there of the African lungfish. But it is believed that some of these lobefin fishes, specifically the lungfishes or dipnoi, entered poorly oxygenated shallow areas of water, requiring them to use their lungs more than their gills. Okay. They believe that over time they used their fins, that during that time they were using their fins, especially their pectoral fins, to help them move across these muddy areas. And the belief is the change in this overall environment that they were adapting to, okay, were the conditions that led to these lobefin fishes evolving into tetrapods. Now, what evidence is there supporting this belief? It has to do with the discovery of a fossil of an organism that they refer to as Tiktaalik, or in lay terms, or easier to say, fishapod. Fossils of this organism were discovered in 2006. Okay, so this is just showing you the Devonian period, what we're talking about with our tetrapods here. But this right here, jumping over, this is the fossils were discovered in 2006 of an organism that they call Tiktaalik, but they named fishapod. Okay, when you look at this organism, or when they looked at the fossils that made up this organism, which were pretty well preserved, what they discovered is that this organism possessed traits or characteristics, okay, resembling a fish, such as it had scales, they believe, fins, gills, and lungs, just like lungfish. However, it also had many traits associated with your tetrapods. Discernible neck, which I don't know if you can see, kind of make out here. Ribs, fin skeleton, flat skull, eyes on the top of its skull instead of spaced out on opposite sides. They were close together, which scientists know when your spacing of your eyes are close together or in a forward direction, that actually helps with depth perception. So you might be given up a wider range of view, but it's in exchange for better depth perception. So going back here, it says it was a discovery of a fossil in 2006 that lends support to that belief, that there was a type of lobe-finned fish. Often they say it's from the phylum Dipnoi, or lungfish. And the fossil of this newly discovered species, known as Tiktaalik or fishapod, it shows both fish and tetrapod characteristics, which are listed here. Okay. Now, they believe that Tiktaalik could most likely prop itself on its fins, specifically its pectoral fins, but not necessarily walk on them. Now, the thing about a rib cage, everybody, you take an A&P class, okay, and you go over the respiratory system. When you talk about the respiratory system, you just don't focus on the lungs. You also include the rib cages and at a minimum 3 different muscle groups, the diaphragm, as well as internal and external intercostal muscles that are attached between the ribs. And the combination of these 3 muscles, along with 12 pairs of ribs, okay, that's what allows your lungs to take in air and exhale air. So this is why it was important to make all these discoveries. Well, when scientists are creating a phylogenetic tree, okay, we talk about parsimony. They try to create it based on the simplest explanation. Okay, but what they don't point out is they're looking for that organism that you could say bridges the gap. We have our lungfish here, and there have been other organisms that have been discovered, but Tiktaalik, okay, was a major find, a major discovery, because it definitely bridged the gap, okay, between our lobe-fin fishes, such as our Dipnoi, our lungfishes, and our tetrapods, such as 2 of 3 that they're showing here, are amphibians. I'm sorry, they're showing all 3 are amphibians, and then our reptiles and mammals, which fall under amniotes. And they're showing you here, when they look at the anatomy in particular of the pectoral fins up here closer to the head, and they compare that anatomy here to the anatomy, make sure I don't circle the wrong one, to the anatomy of Tiktaalik, its pectoral fin, and then to the anatomy as we come down here to our groups here. Say just the anatomy and bone structure, okay, of these pectoral fins to the upper limbs, okay, you can see the bone structure is comparable. And if you recall, you had a lab where you had the label, the humerus, the radius, the ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. The bones may not be 100% the same shape or homologous to each other as far as overall shape goes, but they are present just in different forms. Okay, what they're not showing you is what I talked about before for lobe-fin fishes such as Dipnoi or lungfishes. You have muscle tissue extending out into the fin. You have muscle tissue extending out into the fin of Tiktaalik, especially covering these major bones comparable to the bones that make up our upper limb. And then obviously we have muscles throughout our upper limbs, which we say in lay terms arms. So they're looking for all these finite details, but they look for these organisms, especially that can bridge the gap to try to explain or lend a further explanation to the evolution of different species. Okay, so now if you recall, I said you have to look at this phylogenetic tree. First, you have to notice where it starts with our deuterostomes. And then you kind of got to read both sides to know where we're at. Well, where we're at right now is we're focusing on our organisms that have limbs with digits, which are known as simply tetrapods. And this is what we're going to focus on. So in other words, we are now entering the last 3 of the 11 subphyla that make up our phylum Chordata. So they put the overall phylum's name here. Now, our first phylum that falls under tetrapods are our amphibians, and I just give you a little bit of information for them. Okay, this phylum is divided up into basically 3 clades. Okay, one of the clades is known as Urodela, which means tailed ones, but in lay terms, we're talking about salamanders. Okay, most salamanders, most species don't have actually developed lungs. They breathe through their skin primarily, or gills. Okay, and they retain their tails, that muscular postanal tail, even into adulthood. For the other clade, our frogs, they actually technically go by the clade Anura, which means tailless ones, because they do lack that muscular postanal tail. Now, for our frogs, okay, they have lungs. They're not well developed, and unfortunately, we didn't meet in the lab to dissect the bullfrog, and the pictures I gave you didn't do it any justice. But normally what would happen is in lab, for the last lab, you would dissect the bullfrog and a fetal pig, and you would identify the same anatomical organs. One pair of organs you would identify are the lungs. And in the fetal pig, they look a lot like the lungs they show you for human beings. They stand out, and you can't miss them, along with the heart. But in the bullfrog, as big as these bullfrogs are, when you open up the thoracic cavity or the chest cavity, okay, you can find the heart. It doesn't jump out at you, but you can definitely find it. But you have to search for the lungs. They're there, but they're not as prominent. They're not as fully developed as you see in the fetal pig. Well, it's because frogs not only can breathe through their lungs, they can breathe through their skin. Okay. Then we have our third clade, known as the Cladopoda, the legless ones. In lay terms, they're known as caecilians. They are legless and they are blind. They actually describe them as you can't tell the front from the back, the anterior from the posterior. They live in tropical areas and they tend to burrow into soil. As I said, the amphi and amphibian means both ways of life. What they mean by both ways of life is there's a stage in their life cycle where they live in water-based environments, in other words, an aquatic larva. And then when they undergo metamorphosis, that's where the other way of life comes in. They become terrestrial tetrapods. As I said before, many of them can breathe using lungs, except for most species of salamanders actually don't have lungs, but they can also breathe through the skin underwater. Now they lay soft eggs, fertilized outside of the body. Okay. Once these eggs are fertilized outside of the body, the developing embryo within the egg will hatch into a larva, which will eventually undergo metamorphosis. So here they're showing you salamanders. They're showing you your frog, and then they're showing you the caecilian here. It looks a lot like a snake or a worm. And they're showing you can make out eventually which is the front and which is the back. So you have glass lizards, you have snakes, and you have caecilians. And for snakes and lizards, they'll fall under reptiles. For caecilians, they'll fall under amphibians. And they say you have to really be careful. It's not just an issue of size. I put here the length of these caecilians. They're roughly 3.5 inches to 5 feet. So size necessarily isn't going to help you differentiate between the 3. So you have to take a closer look. So they look at overall anatomical structure, but we're also following the second hypothesis. So they factor in molecular evidence as well. And as we said, the frogs are best known for serving as an example of metamorphosis. Because their juvenile larval stage, we often refer to as a tadpole, is aquatic, and then they will undergo a full metamorphosis where they transform into a terrestrial adult, although they still tend to live in moist habitats. And what they start off with is postnatal tail, eventually will disappear during development. Now, for the last two phyla, the phylum Reptilia and the phylum Mammalia, these two phylums collectively are referred to as amniotes. Okay. In other words, they are tetrapods that have a terrestrially adapted egg. So it says here, amniotes are a group of tetrapods whose extant or living members are the reptiles, including birds, and the mammals. This figure right here is showing you both, except instead of showing you mammals, they use different terms. So over here they have reptiles, but underneath reptiles, for not all forms of reptiles, but for most, they use the term diapsids. Then over here on this side, they don't say mammals, they say mammals way over here. And they're under what they call synapsids. Okay. Term diapsids refers to organisms that when you look at the anatomy of the skull, they have a pair of holes on each side of their skull bones or their skull. Whereas synapsids have only one hole on each side, which is in lay terms known as the ear canal. Okay, I paused for a second. I didn't know if y'all could hear me, and it's telling me that there's a disruption. I hope y'all can hear me again. Okay, so derived traits of amniotes. Well, the reason why species classified under the phylum Reptilia and species classified under the phylum Mammalia are referred to as amniotes is for that one major derived trait. They produce what is referred to as an amniotic egg. This amniotic egg, in addition to containing an embryo, okay, contains four what they refer to as extra embryonic membranes that are responsible for protecting the embryo. These four extra embryonic membranes are called the amnion, the chorion, the yolk sac, and the allantois. Okay. The amniotic eggs of most reptiles and some mammals have a shell. Okay. Now, amniotes have other terrestrial adaptations, such as relatively impermeable skin and the ability to use their rib cage for ventilation. But down here, they're showing you. Here we have our shell. They're just showing you a regular egg that a reptile, say, will produce, or one of three lineages of mammals will produce. You have the outer shell. Then within the shell are those four extra amniotic membranes, which I'm going to go over on the next slide. So the amnion itself, they're pointing here. It's encasing the embryo. Okay, the amnion itself, it directly protects the embryo, and it contains amniotic fluid. It's a fluid-filled sac. So it's highlighted with this blue color. Okay. The chorion, if you look here at the chorion, they're pointing to it here. The chorion itself, along with the allantois, are responsible for gas exchange between the embryo and the air. So they're showing you the allantois is this here, this little sac-like structure. And then the chorion is a membrane surrounding everything in a pinkish color here. Okay. The yolk sac, which they show you right here, well, they tell you down here it serves as a source of nutrients. And then the allantois, which I said here, is not only involved in gas exchange, okay, but it's a waste disposal sac. Okay, it's a disposal sac that receives metabolic waste produced by the embryo, so that'll exit over here, on here. So these are four extra embryonic membranes associated with the amniotic egg. Now, focusing on the phylum Reptilia. Reptiles include what they call tuatara, lizards, snakes, turtles, crocodilians, and birds. Reptiles have scales that contain the protein keratin that creates a barrier, unlike amphibians. However, you also find these same traits in mammals, which they don't really clearly mention. Okay. Again, you take an A&P class and they go into the integumentary system. The star of the integumentary system is what you know in lay terms as the skin, but what's technically called the cutaneous membrane. And part of that cutaneous membrane or skin is made up of cells that are packed full of keratin that make out the outer surface of your skin. So you see this trait for both, and it has the same purpose in us, mammals such as us, as it does with reptiles. Again, unlike amphibians, for both the phylum Reptilia and Mammalia, we breathe using only our lungs. And however, a slight difference that occurs is that most reptiles lay shelled eggs on land, but fertilization occurs internally. Now, with the exception of 1 or 3 lineages for mammals, you don't see this happen. We'll talk about monotremes in a sec. Organisms that lay shelled eggs on land where the offspring will hatch outside of the mom, we refer to these organisms as oviparous. So if you hear that term, they're talking about animals that'll lay eggs, which are your reptiles. And they're showing you down here, snake that's laid eggs, turtle that's laid eggs, and then the offspring hatch outside of the mom's body. And there's no larval stage. Okay, so their appearance at birth is very similar to how they're going to look as an adult, so we call it incomplete metamorphosis. Now, unlike with mammals, however, most reptiles, not including birds, but most reptiles and all amphibians are ectothermic. Okay, that means in order to maintain a certain level of body heat, they have to absorb heat from the surrounding environment. Okay, whereas mammals, all mammals, and then the only group of reptiles that's the exception to being ectotherms are your birds. Mammals and birds, which are reptiles, are endotherms. We have the ability to generate our own heat via our metabolism. In other words, chemical reactions in our body which release heat and that we're able to generate body heat. Therefore, regardless of our surrounding environment, okay, mammals and birds do a pretty good job of maintaining a relatively set body temp, whereas reptiles are dependent on the surrounding environment. As a matter of fact, for snakes, what I came across is that snakes that live in far northern and southern regions, they actually aren't described as oviparous because even though they produce eggs that have the developing offspring in them, they won't lay the eggs because the surrounding environment's too cold. So sometimes for snakes, depending on the environment they live in, if they live in very cold environments, they'll actually retain the developing offspring in the egg. In other words, the egg with the shelled egg inside of their body, and the offspring will hatch within the body and then come out of the mom. The origin and evolutionary radiation of reptiles. The oldest known reptilian fossils date back to the Carboniferous period, and the first major group of reptiles were called parareptiles. They're described as being large, stocky, and quadrupedal herbivores. In other words, walked on all four and were plant eaters. Parareptiles, eventually the numbers declined to where a new form of reptile evolved, which they referred to as diapsids. And these diapsids began to also diversify. Therefore, your diapsids eventually were divided into 2 lineages. One of these lineages they call Lepidosaurs, and the other lineage they call Archosaurs. Okay. The lineage of diapsids that we refer to as Lepidosaurs, this is where it includes our tuateras, our lizards, our snakes, and now extinct mosasaurs. Whereas the other lineage, our Archosaurs, these include our crocodilians, our birds, turtles, and the now extinct dinosaurs. And notice for crocodilians, when they say crocodilians, they're referring to both alligators and crocodiles here. And then they show you a few pictures, such as what the heck is a tuatera and so on down the line. Most others you're familiar with and you know what they look like. Now for birds, birds are reptiles. And again, a lot of this is based on molecular evidence. And I don't know if you've heard, they've talked about in the future, when they represent dinosaurs in figures or videos, don't be surprised if you start seeing them with feathers, because paleontologists, they're starting to believe that, you know what, we misrepresented dinosaurs. We think they actually have feathers on them, just like birds. So with birds, they're archosaurs. However, with birds, their anatomy is described as having undergone major modifications, adaptations, in order to adapt to flight. Okay. One of the major adaptations is they produce wings that are fortified with keratin. What I didn't put in here is that the wings of a bird are not all the same shape. Okay, so these feathers, I'm sorry, the feathers of a bird are not all the same shape. These feathers have different shapes which play a different role in a bird's ability to fly as well as maintain its temp. Other adaptations, they don't have a urinary bladder. The females have only one ovary, and it's very small. Gonads are referring to small gonads referring to the males, and they have no teeth. So they have a lot of modifications for them that allow them to fly. Okay. The last phylum, listen carefully. For the phylum Mammalia in the textbook, they give you a lot of information. Okay. Use the PowerPoint for studying for the exam. Use the PowerPoint as your guide. I'm not saying don't read the additional information. If you're interested, definitely read it. But use this PowerPoint as a guide if you read that portion of the text, okay? Because there's a lot more than what I want you to know. For mammals, again, they're also amniotes, except mammals have a second trait that reptiles don't. And this has to do with down here, mammary glands. Okay. So for mammals that are classified under the phylum Mammalia, it says class Mammalia, phylum Mammalia, they're represented by 5,300 species. So we add on some traits, additional traits to that chordate body plan for mammals. The key one being mammary glands. Okay. For mammals, you will find they develop mammary glands which produce milk to help nourish their young. Another key trait is hair. Mammals develop hair or grow hair. If you think about it, you look at the others, the reptiles, we say feathers, but everybody else, we haven't mentioned any hair growth. This is another trait you see unique to mammals. A high metabolic rate due to the fact that we're endotherms or endothermic. Okay, we are able to maintain a set body temp. A larger brain than other vertebrates of equivalent size, and differentiated teeth. Not all the teeth are shaped the same. They each serve a different function. So early in the evolution of mammals, mammals are said to belong to a group of amniotes, as I said, called synapsids. That just means there's one hole on each side of the skull, which we often refer to as ear canal. Now they believe by the early Cretaceous period, right here. In other words, we talked about the Cretaceous mass extinction event. So about the time of the early Cretaceous period, if you recall, many of the dinosaurs are believed to have been wiped out. That allowed those small nocturnal mammals that survived, or that are believed to have survived, to have more of a free reign across terrestrial habitats. And they believe that led to adaptive radiation, which in turn led to 3 living lineages of mammals that are extant animals. In other words, that are present day living. These 3 lineages are called the monotremes, the marsupials, and the eutherians. We would go under eutherians here, but there's a lot that goes under eutherians. However, mammals did not undergo a significant adaptive radiation, as I said before, until the Cretaceous mass extinction event. I forgot to emphasize it, that there was a mass extinction event right before. We did talk about it, though, back when we talked about the history of the Earth. Now, briefly for monotremes, the 2 examples of monotremes, the echidnas and the platypus. Okay. Now, what monotremes have in common is they're the only known egg-laying mammals. Okay, the only egg-laying mammals. However, they're endotherms. And if you look here, they develop here. Here it does have some hair, although it looks like it has more needles than hair. A little bit of information on the marsupials. Well, first, marsupials consist of our koalas, kangaroos, and it says opossums, but I'm used to just calling them possums. Okay. Now, in this case for marsupials, the embryo does develop within a placenta in the mother's uterus. However, what will happen is the offspring will be born very early to where they describe it as embryonic. I should have put embryonic / fetal development will continue to occur, but within a maternal pouch called the marsupium. Okay, and I got to fix this. On the actual PowerPoint, this figure's not in the way of the text, okay? For whatever reason, it happens when I upload it to Collaborate. So development of the offspring will begin in the mother's uterus, but it's not completed until the offspring, enters the marsupium, which is the pouch of the marsupial. Now, in regards to marsupials, the second lineage and the third lineage, eutherians, what scientists discovered is on the continent of Australia. Is Australia a continent? Yes or no? Okay, just checking. Only one person answered me. Kyle, the answer is yes. One of 7 continents. Just want to check with y'all, that's all. Didn't know if y'all were listening or not. What about the rest of you? Only a couple of people answered there. Okay, so listen carefully. On the continent of Australia, okay, a process called convergent evolution is believed to have occurred. If you look down here, in evolutionary biology, convergent evolution is a process whereby organisms not closely related, in other words, they're not part of the same monophyletic group, independently evolve similar traits as a result of having to adapt to similar environments or ecological needs. So what they discovered is that for this second lineage, marsupials, and the third lineage, eutherians, the marsupials, many if not most, which are found on the continent of Australia, many of them, okay, based on physical appearance, actually look very similar to many eutherians. But when looked at in closer detail, and including molecular analysis, okay, they're not part of the same monophyletic group. So they refer to this as convergent evolution. So in Australia, convergent evolution has resulted in a diversity of marsupials that resemble our third lineage, eutherians, that live in other parts of the world. So this is something scientists have to be careful about. And like I said, we're following the second hypothesis. So molecular data definitely plays a part. So the third lineage are our eutherians, or what they call placental mammals. Compared with marsupials, eutherians have a more complex placenta. Young eutherians complete their embryonic development within the uterus, joined to the mother by the placenta. Thus, eutherians are known as viviparous animals. That's where the offspring develops in the uterus, okay, fully before birth. Molecular and morphological data give conflicting dates on the diversion of eutherians. Now, eutherians itself includes the order of primates. So this is where the textbook is going to start giving you definitely way more info than I want you to know. Okay, so the clade eutherian, what I want you to focus on, or this lineage eutherians, I want you to focus on the order of primates. The mammalian order of primates includes our lemurs, our tarsiers, our monkeys, and our apes. And for the apes, well, that's where humans are classified, under apes. Okay, now, so we add on even more traits. Okay, so make sure we're 34, chapter 34. If you can't figure out where to start, well, go through the PowerPoint, and everywhere you see a list of traits, just write those on something separate or type them in a separate document and just arrange them in the order of, evolutionary complexity, if you want to call it. Okay. So now within the traits for mammals, we add on to that traits for primates, okay, to their body plan, in other words. Hands and feet adapted for grasping, flat nails, an even larger brain with an even shorter jaw, forward-looking eyes, okay, that are much closer together, and this helps with depth perception. Higher neurological functions associated with social behavior and parental care, fully opposable thumbs in monkeys and apes. Okay, so you can see they give you a list right here. Okay, And right here, this term here is just referring to the classification of apes. So when we talk about apes, it includes humans, but not just humans. It includes New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, gibbons, orangutans, and gorillas, as well as chimpanzees and bonobos. So this is that same figure enlarged. Okay. And then I left some figures in here. Uh, New World monkeys versus Old World monkeys. I put some things I'll look up, such as what is the difference between the two. And I misplaced my notes. I put my thoughts on paper sometimes. But there is definitely a difference between New and Old World monkeys, although they're classified under primates. Show you your gibbons, your orangutans, your gorillas, your chimpanzees. You don't see these guys much, but these are bonobos. To me, physically, they resemble or are most closely related to humans. However, molecular data, specifically when comparing genetic information, were most closely associated with chimpanzees. When you compare the human genome to a chimpanzee's genome, it's homologous up to 99%. And that's what I mentioned here. And even with gorillas, it's over 90%. So humans are mammals that have a large brain and bipedal locomotion. The species Homo sapiens is about 200,000 years old, which is very young considering that life on Earth is believed to have first originated, tripping over my tongue, is believed to have first originated on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. Okay, let me ask y'all, it's a review question, even though the test is just going to be on current events. What general type of living organisms are believed to have first come into existence on Earth? We went over this in chapter 25 when we went over the history of Earth. Does anybody remember? Yeah, prokaryotes. Now, if you look here, now on top of primates, we're going to add on more traits specifically for humans. There are a number of characters that distinguish humans from other apes. In other words, we add on to the body plan here if we focus on specifically humans, such as upright posture and bipedal locomotion. Okay, you may have seen chimpanzees or even bonobos get up on two legs, but that's not how they move full time, whereas we do. Even larger brains that have become more complex and even higher level neurological functions that include the ability to speech, symbolic thought, artistic expressions, the manufacture and use of complex tools. We have an even further reduced jawbone, as well as reduced jaw muscles, but that's tied into this here. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I like to use fire to cook my food, I guess you could say. And then we have a shorter digestive tract also. And that can be tied into how we prepare our food, requiring less mechanical and chemical digestion. And this is just showing you how the skull, which consists of facial bones and cranial bones, has evolved over time to where now we have the human skull. Again, you take an A&P class, when you go over the bones of the skull, they'll divide the bones of the skull into facial bones and cranial bones, just to let you know, okay? But it's the bones of the skull they're showing you here. Okay. I didn't expect the lecture to go that long. We just had a little bit of information to go over. You have an exam a week from today. We will not have class on Tuesday. However, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. If you feel you need to meet with me in person, that's fine. Tuesday would be a good day if you have time to wait till then. If not, let me know sooner. I'll meet with you on Blackboard Collaborate. If not, you have an exam a week from today. Okay, it's the same process all over that we did for the first three. By Tuesday, I'll post a message about the exam. Third, couple of minutes before 12:30, the exam 4 should appear at 12:30. You have 50 multiple choice questions covering chapters 32, 33, and 34. Okay, and then that'll be it. It's just the same procedure as before. Are there any questions?